Hi, this is Jeff Johnson here. Along with my good friend and colleague Rick Avalos, we'd like to welcome you to our series we like to call Conversations With. On this adventure, Rick and I are heading to the home of our dear friends Coleen and John Graybill in Buena Vista, Colorado. John is the great-grandson of Edward S. Curtis, well known for his stunning portrait photography of Native Americans. John is the great-grandson of Edward S. Curtis, well known for his stunning portrait photography of Native Americans in the early 1900s. The faces and stories that Curtis has captured are full of life and rich history. What's even more exciting about this project is the fact that they now photograph the faces of the descendants of these great Native Americans that Edward Curtis once captured. On today's visit, we're going to chat with Coleen and John about this exciting project, the books they have created, the gear and the printing techniques they've used, and what the future holds for this project. So we thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoy this adventure as much as we have creating it.
So I'm going to kind of open up this chat, this visit, and Jeff, I'm sure you have some questions that you'd like to start us off with.
Oh, absolutely. But first, as Rick mentioned, thank you for taking the time to sit down with us. And we've known you guys for so long and have been very loving of what you're doing, and so very fortunate to be part of it. But I don't think we have any ideas how deep it's going, and that's kind of what we're doing here today, is to see more about what this is all about, what you're spending your free time doing. So I guess, as
what little there might be.
What little there might be. Okay, forget
Free time.
Scratch free time from that and all of your waking hours. But I think that probably the easiest way is let's just start with the project itself. Just tell us what got you started, what made you think you needed to continue, as you mentioned to me earlier, this project that Curtis started.
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, Jeff, so thank you.
Sure.
And both of you, welcome into our home. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
It's an honor for us to do this with you. But so, as you know, Coleen, well, all of you were part of the Colorado Springs Guild for eons. And so Coleen and I start hanging out together and doing our photography thing, and that's back when we were doing mountain spirit photography. She introduces me to the Guild and I become a member. And early on, I think she had a conversation with John and about who my great-grandfather was, unbeknownst to me. And so John approaches me and says, "So I hear you're the great-grandson. Would you give a talk for Guild?" And it's like, "No, I don't do that." Shut him down right then and there, see you, bye. And so we go home and Coleen says, "Well, you have a date to present at the Guild meeting on." So her and John had gotten together and kind of
I'm like, yeah, I'll
conspired.
coach him. He'll be all right.
Outnumbered for sure.
Yeah, and so I knew a little bit about my great-grandfather at that point, but growing up in our household, we had a few pictures on the wall like we do here, but my dad never talked about his grandfather. And it turns out he had this disdain for people profiting off of Curtis's work when Curtis never made any money. And so my dad just loathed those people that were profiting off of his grandfather's work.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so I grew up in this environment where we don't talk about it, we don't discuss it, nothing. So I got to get ready for this presentation at Guild. So I'm reading my grandma's book and Mick Gidley. I had the crash course, yes. I probably knew enough to talk for about 5 minutes, and I was told I had 90 minutes, so I get all done, and I'm doing a keynote presentation, and we dry run it with some people, and it was like 2.5 hours.
So much for his 5-minute talk.
Right.
Yeah, so we sliced and diced it and kind of narrowed it down to what we talked about at Guild, and I was really super nervous. I never did that kind of thing. So here I'm in front of this huge group talking about this stuff.
Well, in front of friends too, that always makes it more challenging, I think.
Yes, yes, yeah. All friends there at the Guild, and so it went pretty well. I mean, I got a standing ovation, and I was told that doesn't happen very often. And so after that, Coleen and I were chatting. I think we might have even been out in the hot tub out back. So,
We were.
we were.
That's where we hold our business meetings. I was full attention
We should have done
then.
this interview in the hot tub.
We could have.
Whoa. So we're chatting, and we're talking about the presentation, and it was fun for me. I learned a lot about Curtis and gained a new appreciation for him going through that process. And so Colleen's like, well, have you ever thought about finding descendants of the people that Curtis photographed, and then you photograph them? And so in the back of my head, I can hear my dad just hollering at me, no, don't go there, John. No, you can't do this stuff. Anything to do with Curtis, that's taboo. But we talked about it, and so it became obvious in that moment that it couldn't be just a photograph. There had to be more depth and meaning to it. And so we tossed it around for a while and kind of put together this Descendants project idea of doing that, seeking out these people that were descendants of the photographs from Curtis and photographing them. And
Logistically, that had to have been a chore in itself, huh? Tracking down the
Find these
descendant.
people, right?
actually, at least early on, when people heard who we were and what we were doing, it just fell into our laps.
Really?
It did. It was
Well,
weird.
not really.
Colleen had to do some
So
footwork.
that's a lot of my job with the project is finding
Yes.
these people.
Okay.
And that was kind of leading me into, I don't want to get too far off track here, but,
Right.
because Colleen, I mean, we've known you forever and accomplished an award-winning portrait photographer and scenic photographer that you are, your role in all of this, and it's starting to be revealed now.
Right. It's not as photographer.
Right.
And because we needed the descendant of Curtis to be photographing the descendants
Right.
of the people. So
Yeah.
it made that connection. So I've become the when we're out in the field photographing, I've become the second.
No, I'm not photographing them that way.
It does a little bit.
But you look at Curtis's work, and he had perfect Renaissance lighting in so many of his portraits.
Right, yeah, that's what I've noticed
That
too.
Out in the field.
ingrained in me is paying attention to that lighting and to that posing that makes that lighting, because it doesn't just happen.
Was that your goal, is to create the newer portraits to really emulate what the old style looked like? Or?
Not necessarily in the posing, but in the overall look and feel of it.
Yeah, we're
Yes.
not trying to copy it, but
Yeah, but we want
the feel.
We want that feel.
Sure.
But back to finding the descendants, I started out on Facebook, and with different.
Why not?
I know, different Native American old photograph kind of pages, and then I would read down through all the comments. And
Really?
so when I'd find a Curtis image being posted, I would look down through the comments.
So you found that there was already an established following of Curtis's work?
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, there definitely is.
Association or just people in general, descendants in general, were following?
Descendants, historians, a lot of photographers follow his work, because if you went to photography school, you more than likely even had to study his work. So, yeah, so there's quite a following there. But so I would find people that say, oh, that's my great-great-grandfather, or, and so then I would send them a message telling them what we're doing. Sometimes they would answer me, sometimes they wouldn't. I don't know if that's because they're like John, who hates social media and never looks at his messages, or whether it's just, okay, here's another crackpot white person trying to, make themselves feel good by helping the Native Americans. And so you never know really what the reason they don't respond, but the ones that do respond, I've had very much success rate with and contacting them. Some of them, like the Red Cloud family. I knew that was one of Curtis's significant portraits, so I wanted to hopefully find a descendant of Red Cloud.
Red Cloud.
The Red Cloud.
Wow.
So I look up Descendants of
Hanging on
Red
the wall
Cloud,
up there.
and up pops all these articles about a Henry Red Cloud. And what Henry's doing is teaching solar to Native Americans to be able to bring it back to their communities and to provide job skills. So I very nervously looked up the phone number for Henry Red Cloud and called him, and he's the sweetest, nicest guy. And I'm, now
Grandson, great grandson.
he is the great grandson.
Two greats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fifth generation.
He was all for it.
And he was all for it. He's like, I would love to talk
What a
to you.
great start to your story of having somebody that actually wants to be part of it without having to jump hoops.
Yes.
Well, he wasn't the first.
He wasn't our first. I'll let
So-
you tell that story.
The first native portrait that Curtis does is on the beach in Seattle, and it's of Princess Angeline. And he convinces her to go up to his studio in Seattle and has her sit, pays her a silver coin, and does the famous portrait of Princess Angeline. And so that was his first native formal portrait. Everything else was kind of a people and landscape type stuff that he was doing. And we had been out visiting my parents after we'd put them into assisted living, and we were always talking about this stuff. And my dad says, yeah, we don't take phone calls from people anymore asking for help. And I said, well, pass those on to me, Dad. I'll take those now. The very first call we get is from Yvonne Raymond in Seattle doing a documentary to celebrate Curtis's 150th birth year. And so he tells us about the project, says, I want you guys to come out and be in the documentary. And so then we're talking a little bit about what we're doing. And at this point, it was just a conceptual idea about what we want to do. And Vaughn says, well, I can introduce you to the descendant of Princess Angeline if you would like. Hell yeah. And so this is another example how this stuff just kind of fell into our
As you
lap.
say, it's kind of fallen at you.
We didn't seek her out, but the spirits moved. And so my first Native American portrait was a descendant of Princess Angeline.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I get goosebumps thinking about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Just that
And
connection.
there was a deep emotional connection, oddly, between Mary Lou Slaughter was her name, between Mary Lou and John. She kept saying, can I have your husband? She's 80, which now she's like 85, but yeah, there was just such a connection between she and John, and
She
it
had
was
a
like
great sense of humor.
we'd all known each other forever.
She was
That's
fun to work
fantastic.
with, and she was wonderful. When it comes to this indigenous population, it's whatever their wishes, whatever they want, we honor that.
Because
Without question.
they will be spotlighted. They'll be, I mean, in purpose or production of the Descendants project will be a coffee table book that'll have their photograph of their ancestor, the photograph we take of them, and then the story that's written about them. And all that'll go into a coffee table book, as well as exhibits, which we're already booking exhibits for the final
So
product.
they'll give you information and then you will write the story, is it?
We have a Native American writer. We have a gal who lives on a reservation, has Native children. We have several different writers. We decided to make them more area specific.
Right.
That way they understood the culture of that area, because the South is very different than the
Right, and that triggers a really good point, Colleen, when you say area specific, because I think someone can get the impression, or some people can get the impression, that Mr. Curtis was predominantly in the Northwest, but he covered pretty much all the United States, didn't he? The Southwest, did he, the Plains?
Yes, Plains, Southwest. So the territory that he worked in was everything west of the Mississippi.
Okay.
Mexico border all the way up through Canada and into Alaska.
Wow.
And he didn't hit every tribe.
Sure.
Because there's just
Don't
so.
see how you could.
Yeah, there's so
Well,
many. But he.
Our state here in Colorado is a great example. There's nothing from Colorado.
He didn't
And the
photograph
timeline,
any
what are we talking
ute.
about here? When he was actually traveling and doing his work.
So there's photographs that he made as early as 1895 that we're aware of the natives, the Tulalip Reservation north of Seattle. And then Princess Angeline, she dies May of 1896. So we don't know the exact date, but it had to have been prior to that, and I think it was late.
Yeah. And where I was going with that was him covering the plains, well, everything west of the Mississippi, north and south. It ain't like you can get in a plane and go to the next venue,
what I'm
you know,
thinking,
back
yeah.
then.
No, a lot of it was still territories. You know,
They weren't even states.
That's a good point, yeah.
yeah, it goes back a ways.
And I'm thinking, how did he get these portraits lined up? I mean, how did he call ahead? Did he have his agent call ahead? I mean, you know,
Kinda.
just really, okay, so, yeah.
So he had a trusted scout that worked with him, Alexander Upshaw. And Upshaw was one that had been through the Carlisle School for Indians and graduated. And this was an individual that was incredibly intelligent, tried to do everything that the white man asked of him. And how Curtis met him, I'm not sure, but Upshaw was instrumental, at least in the early days, of going into a tribe ahead of Curtis and letting them know what the project was about and what would happen. And he could talk to them in their language and put them at ease and answer questions. And Upshaw actually did field notes and may have written some of the stuff in the volumes.
That's interesting because you mentioned Carlisle. That's Jim Thorpe's alma mater.
Yeah.
I wonder if they ever crossed paths at any time.
It's possible. I don't know the timeline for both of those when they were there, but yeah, that's very possible.
That's interesting.
And back then, those boarding schools were not a nice place. I mean, they were horrific. You know, and Canada's gone through the reconciliation process with their boarding schools, but we've not done that here in the U.S. yet. And we're seeing glimpses of it starting to happen, but that'll be something that we'll see here in the near future, I hope.
That's a whole nother interview.
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
Well, we can come back, so.
Well, you guys, you have enough of where we can do many interviews.
Yeah.
So Upshaw does lay the groundwork and just paves the way for Curtis to come in. Curtis also had a newspaper man from Seattle, William Meyers, who was phenomenal. This guy had an ear where he could listen to somebody talking in their native tongue, and then he could write it out phonetically. And so he's got a lot of language written in the back of the volumes for each of the tribes. And he was fantastic at shorthand, so he could write things out as Curtis is interviewing. And he went ahead of Curtis lots of times too, and would set the groundwork. But probably the most significant thing with all of that is the natives recognized Curtis's appreciation of their spirituality.
Okay, that's good.
And that gained a lot of inroads for Curtis, where other people, the dominant society, didn't understand that they even had a religion, let alone that it was as deep and spiritual as it was. So Curtis gained a lot of respect that way, and gradually as it progressed, word would get out, and people would meet him kind of with open arms when he'd go in.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it
have
really
that,
is.
Because it's a unique project that he's doing, and yet to have people in the different tongues and have to have scouts and people go ahead and set this up to think I can walk in there and this is going to be no big deal, just sit down and pose for a photograph. That's a pretty big, I wish.
He didn't.
He
He,
didn't
still
do-
didn't just walk in.
That's what I'm saying. It's
Yeah,
like, yeah.
he still had to go.
Not like we can do nowadays. It's not that way at all.
Right,
Yeah.
no. He needed to go into these different camps and spend time and spend time just being there and
Probably
helping
earn their
and
trust and-
earn their trust.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
Why he was there.
You know what I really appreciate, and actually I hope that our viewers appreciate, is that we're, however long, almost 40 minutes maybe into this visit, we hardly have spoken anything about his photography, but his humanitarianism is what is
Yeah.
really exciting, and what I appreciate in the spirituality that you just talked about. And so that's just such a big part of his life, it seems to me, right?
It is, you know, and I find it somewhat of a sad commentary that people flock to the photographs that he made, but that is testimony to the photographic master that he was. I mean, his work is beautiful, but he even writes in his memoirs that the photographs support the text, not the other way. So the text is the main body of what he did.
There you go.
And he covers every aspect of their life. Their religion, their games, their food, their dress, their government, everything
their
about.
ceremonies, their,
Yes.
yeah.
Now, in interviewing a lot of the ancestors that were, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 times generations, do you find that a lot of their history is oral, or is it written, or is it both?
Well,
Most-
Or does it
I-
depend on the different
there's
nations?
more written now, but they all talk about their oral history, and that's how they communicate, is through oral storytelling. I'll add this about oral history, and this was kind of unique. We were with Tamara Stands and Looks Back Spotted Tail, and out on the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. And she's a dear friend of ours. And we were photographing Vanessa Red Hawk, a descendant of Chief Red Hawk, who is in the iconic photograph Oasis in the Badlands. That's my favorite. So in volume 3, in which I was particularly interested in, was the story that Curtis wrote about the white buffalo calf woman. Kind of for the Lakota, that's their savior, as Jesus was to the Christians. And so I asked Tamara to read through that and compare it to what had been passed down to her. And she says, yeah, it's the same, plus there's stuff I didn't know that was written by Curtis. And so Tamara was relating the oral histories passed down through her elders to the story that Curtis captured a long time ago compared to current day, and they matched.
That's the question that came up to my mind, is when you talk about they were all sharing the stories verbally. There wasn't any written, there wasn't anything painted, there wasn't anything, and yet they're the same story.
That's-
Yes, that's a pretty
Just
amazing.
think about the,
What is it called, the telephone game, or the we talk to
Right,
each other. By the time
right.
it gets back to the
It's completely
first
different.
person, it's totally different. That's just really pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the most famous quotes by Curtis is, "I want to make them live forever."
nice.
And that was essentially his purpose. Through the photographs, through the text that he wrote, his passion, we believe, came from truly wanting to make sure that this information was put in ink for future generations, and that their descendants would be able to see it and hear it directly from them. Yes, he was white. That gets a lot of criticism. And there are times, and I've seen it, and I've heard it from especially one of our descendants saying, this is not how we look at it. But Curtis's own implicit biases, which we understand now, but they didn't then, is how much our own background, our own upbringing plays into just how we view something. And Curtis was describing the unbelievability almost of a ceremony of a person reappearing and in a different place than what they disappeared from in one of their ceremonies. And she explained it that, how is this any different than what Christians believe about Jesus? So why was he assuming that this was some trick and that it was a show? It wasn't. It was their sacred ceremonies. And so those things did play into it, but his true heart was that he wanted to make sure these beautiful cultures moved forward in time. And whatever he could do to help that happen is where his energy came from.
Well, that's an amazing point for those of us now and the future generations to realize that was his purpose, was to really put the stories out there as they were from the natives' point of view, not from some white guy with a camera
Right.
to make a pretty picture. Yeah. Well, it's like, many other things. Being photographers, we're drawn to photography books, and you see these beautiful portraits and such. You don't realize how much deeper, like you mentioned earlier, John, that this was not so much about the photographs as it is the text, the copy that's written. The photographs just support that. That's so impressive to me right there. I want to start reading all those books now to really understand fully where he came from, what he was doing, and sharing with us.
This same descendant, I showed her some images that were other images that were in the volume, and she just was gasping. She's like, "Oh my gosh, look at this! There's see this feather in the tree, that means this, and see this rock at the base of the tree, that means this, and this is brought in from that." Things that I never in a million years would have even noticed or known that they were placed there purposefully. And she was so thrilled to see that in a photograph and know that it's right there in black and white, that's how they did it then too.
That's neat.
And so it's really powerful when we meet these descendants and they see these things in the images, that they realize how their culture has, how far it goes back and how it has come forward in the same manner. And
So where was Mr. Curtis born? Where was he from originally?
Well, as far as we know, he's born in Whitewater, Wisconsin. No birth certificate that we've been able to find. And it's possible he was born in another town, but just used that town because everybody would recognize it. So we think that's where it was.
Okay. And Wisconsin, of course, they have Native American, Indian populations as well. And I guess kind of where I'm going with that is where he grew up, and having done so much work in the Northwest and the Southwest, well, all over west of the Mississippi, north and south. Do you have any information about him camping or living with the tribes, or did he pretty much stay out on his location wherever he traveled and set up camp?
Well, he did do a lot of camping with his father early on, and we believe that's where he got a lot of the skills that he used for the project. And his dad was in the Civil War, came back kind of sickly, was a preacher, and Edward would go with him on his trips, and often they would camp.
I'm sorry, and I misled you, because I was thinking if he camped with the subjects that he was photographing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
yes.
You know, when he would bring his wagon and all of his gear in, he would, as Coleen was saying earlier, he'd kind of hang out in the camp, kind of to let people get used to him. After a couple of days, he would start helping them gather wood, water, whatever it was.
So he assimilated.
He was getting in their lifestyle then.
He
yeah,
did.
To really understand.
Well,
Well, and it's not undifferent than what we do as photographers doing portrait work. If you can't build that rapport, you're not going to get a great picture. Right. And so he was doing that way back then. It was a thing for him.
Well, how did he pick up his first camera? What made him want to photograph?
He did a short stint as an apprentice for a newspaper in St. Paul. And that's where he first got his introduction into photography. And it wasn't until later, the family had come upon really hard times, and Edward's dad, Johnson Curtis, they decided that they're going to move to the Washington Territory, a little town called Sydney, and start over there, because this is the fastest growing area in the continent. is out in Seattle. So Edward and his dad move out there. They homestead, they get, 150 some acres. And they're planting fruit trees and all this stuff, and they build a log cabin by hand. We've actually been in that cabin, which was kind of cool. But so they get everything set, it's ready for the family. They send word, the rest of the family comes out, and 3 days after they get there, the old man Curtis dies from pneumonia. And so Edward has to support the family again. And he and his brother Ashel take on all kinds of jobs. They're fishing, they're splitting wood, they're making bricks at the brick factory. Edward takes a job with a logging company where he hurts his back, and that injury lays him up for almost a year, and he realizes after that he can't do the physical labor anymore. So he goes back to this apprenticeship that he had in St. Paul and buys into a photography studio in Seattle, mortgages the property for $150, and
Wow.
I think his mom was a little upset about that.
Sure. Spent all
But
her money.
yeah, and so he gets started as a photographer in Seattle in a portrait studio, and soon after that, the studio is in his name. The first one was Guptill and Curtis, and there were a couple of studios that he had in between, but eventually he ends
Partners.
up, partners, and eventually he's on his own, and for whatever reason, he's like a master at this, with a 6th grade education. So I'm not sure where he learned it at, except out of, what was the magazine back then, for the photography?
Oh,
Scribner's.
Wilson's Photographic.
Wilson's Photographic. He got a lot of stuff out of that magazine, but
Learning photography and posing and developing and
it's funny, the things those old magazines talk about are kind of the same we still talk about
Isn't that
today.
interesting?
It is.
So it's true.
Copyright, the Uncle Bob's, and pricing, all that stuff. But at any rate, so he gets his start there doing portraits, and he's so good at it, he's got like a line out the door, and rapidly becomes known. If you want your portrait done and you're anybody, this is where you go in Seattle to get it done. And I think probably it was the volume of people that he was snapping the shutter for. He gets bored to tears with that. And that's when he starts venturing out and going up Mount Rainier and out to the Sound and photographing the natives on the beach. And
So
such.
that was his weekend to get away from it all. Like most of us, we're photographers all week, and yet we get away from it all by going and photographing a mountain instead of a person. So he was kind of doing the same thing, and
Absolutely,
so that was
yes.
how the start got. He just went out and found.
Some of the Native Americans to photograph as opposed to the family.
There's a great story about Curtis back when he was getting bored with the portrait work in the studio and needed to get out for some fresh air. And as we know, he spent a lot of time on Mount Rainier. This one trip, he's backpacking his large view camera, which is an 18 by 22. And back then they're made out of wood, right?
Yeah.
The thing's huge.
And
It's
brass, I would support.
heavy.
Yeah.
4-foot bellows.
The tripod to support that.
Yes, the old rickety wood ones, nothing like what we use nowadays. And then the glass plates, I mean, that's like a picture window almost, it's so big. There's a lot of weight there. And he's gonna go up Mount Rainier and he wants to photograph Snoqualmie Glacier and decides he needs help getting his gear up the mountain. So he talks to a local farmer and borrows a donkey. And the guy says, this donkey will backpack you up there and all your gear will be great. It's a good donkey. So Curtis does this and he saddles up all of his gear and they go up and he gets up to the glacier and he unpacks his gear and makes his photograph. And he's done with his photograph, and so now he's got to come back down. So he packs it all up, packs it on the donkey, and I don't know if he gave the donkey a signal or what, but he's done loading the donkey, and then somehow the donkey knows, sits down on its butt, and glides down Mount Rainier. And Curtis is like, no, my camera, my glass plates. And the donkey disappears down the mountain somewhere. And so Curtis is like, well, starts walking down. And he gets down, the donkeys just stand there waiting for him.
Still everything all together? in the
Everything's
back?
all together. He's like, wow, what a stroke of luck, So he takes the donkey back to return to the farmer, and he's asking the farmer, so what's with this donkey? And I loaded him up, and he slid down the mountain. Oh, I taught him to do that. Go slide all the way
Could've shared
down.
that with Curtis.
Right. Give him a little warning heads up.
Heads up.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
No, I can't. I'm trying to think of the gear nowadays.
Your prize gear, whatever it was, today or back then.
What would you guess the weight of all of that gear might have been?
Glass plates are heavy.
The plates themselves are, I
How
don't
thick are they?
have any idea, but
See.
heavy.
Hundreds of pounds.
And how many?
Probably, yeah.
But how many would he take? On
I
an
think
The
on this
story
trip,
only took two.
2.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I didn't think of the
But can
stories.
you imagine how do you package that where
I-
you don't
I-
break
Yeah.
an
Why would you
18
tell
by
me something
22 inch
this
piece
size?
of glass?
The slightest bump would snap it. I don't know how.
Yeah.
He didn't have probably styrofoam pellets to pack around it.
And you imagine that's a day out excursion, much less when he goes out for an extended period of time.
Point.
yes.
And climbing Mount Rainier is no
Yeah.
picnic. It's
Especially back then, it was all canvas and wool gear. It's not like
Right,
today's
right.
gear. It's-
And now we're speaking as if he went out like himself. At some point, did he have assistants and people that helped him with gear? And
Rick, I've found no documentation that
Really?
he went with anybody. He was on his own. He he made the paths that other people followed, so to speak.
That's impressive right there.
yes, it is.
Well, to get to that spot and photograph whatever that nobody else has been to, there's a dream of all of us. But
Right.
Wheelies can
Hard to
carry
do
our cameras at
nowadays.
this size on a backpack, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, we've got a picture of him on Rainier, different trip, with his gear, and he's got this big bulky pack on, and then he's carrying his camera and stuff. It's
like a suitcase kind of thing in his arm, and
And he's alone.
well, he
well,
was with,
and
in
that
this
he
one,
was with others.
2 other people, but it's like, how could you possibly climb a mountain with your gear under your arms like that? It's just
Full
nuts.
determination.
He led
Yes.
many trips for the Mazamas mountain climbing group out of Portland. And he ended up leading a lot of groups up Mount Rainier because he knew the mountain really well. And then his brother ended up being, I think, the first official, like, paid guide on Mount Rainier.
Wow.
Yeah. Aishel, both brothers were accomplished mountaineers on Rainier.
Was
And
Aishel
other
his
mounts.
brother? Was
Aishel
he a
was his
photographer
brother.
at all?
Yes.
Yes, he was.
Really?
Yeah, Curtis taught him how and brought him into the studio and had Aishel taking pictures. In fact, early on, they sent, the family sent Aishel up to document the gold rush up in the Yukon. Or was it the Klondike?
Don't remember. Alaska.
Okay.
Anyway, so the family, like for months, like 6 months, they can food, they sew tents, they build clothing, they put gear together, and they send Aishel up to photograph up there. And he goes up, and they get some pictures back early on, and they're wonderful pictures.
You had mentioned early on in our conversation that he really didn't make any money, and that was one of the reasons your dad was, reticent about sharing any information. How did they sustain themselves during all this? Him and Aishel, and
Well, they used
Someone-
a lot of the money from the studio.
studio,
The
right.
studio was successful.
oh, they still maintain the studio.
They did.
Oh, okay.
Curtis had staff eventually that would run
Oh,
the
okay.
studio and do the photographing while he's out in the field doing his work.
Okay.
So that was a source of income. He mortgaged everything multiple times, like to the hilt. And the sad thing is, Edward's out doing his work in the field, working with the natives, and his wife and his oldest daughter are at home running the studio. And Clara, his wife, had the answer to all the collectors pounding on the door.
Oh, jeez.
And that wore on her, and at some point she files for divorce.
When he was never home,
Oh,
he
so
was
that's what I'm
not
thinking.
really a husband. He
That
wasn't,
wasn't a weekend trip he was doing. Those
right.
were-
He wasn't really
gone for
being
months.
father to the 3 children they had at that point. They ended up having a 4th. But, you know, he wasn't a husband, he wasn't a father, he was never there. When he was working. He hardly slept, you know, which is a characteristic
That
of
says normal.
very smart people. Yeah, well, it was photographers.
What did he do with the photographs that he made of the natives?
Well, so this is an interesting topic, and I don't know how far you want to go into this, but so he's shooting everything on glass plate negative, right?
Right.
In today's world, we go out and we photograph and we take the memory card out and we stick it in the computer and we offload that onto multiple external hard drives. Some of us even off-site backup of this stuff because that's how we make our living, right? Mm-hmm. So what did they do back then? They didn't have that, right? So they made another photograph of the negative. So they would make multiple copies that then were studio copies, and they'd stash away the original and work off those studio copies. You know, and when Clara files for divorce, 1916, finally they get Curtis out of the field in 1919 to go before the judge, and the judge sides with Clara and awards her everything. Okay. The studio, the equipment, the negatives, the houses, everything. And so when Curtis's oldest daughter, my Aunt Beth, learns of this, she takes employees into the studio and they make copies. They make a bunch of gold tones. And they take those original negatives across the street to the Cobb building. And they smash them. And people hear this and they go, oh, they smashed the negative, the glass plate negative, but they had studio copies, so it's not as
They didn't
catastrophic.
lose it. It just sounded terrible.
It sounds horrible, right? It'd be like your memory card getting thrown away or something, but you've offloaded it, so you're okay. Yeah. Hopefully.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I can't even fathom what kind of storage facility they'd
That's what
have
I'm
to
thinking.
have to store the bulk of all those negatives. You know, and there, at one point there was a fire at the studio, you know, and it didn't damage a whole lot and everything was saved, but there was a fire.
So I'm wondering what all these trips he's doing, is he traveling out and photographing and then bringing things back and processing back at home, or is he setting up and processing on site?
He did some processing on site because we know he did cyanotypes in the field, checking exposure, focus, that kind of stuff. And I think he showed those to the people that he had photographed. Say, hey, here's the picture.
That was
we
his
did
Polaroids, right?
Right. Back in the day, that was it. And so behind you guys, this is a really unique photograph titled Three Chiefs. And that was done, we believe, in 1900 in Browning, Montana with the Blackfeet. And that is what we call a POP, or a printout process. And so much like a cyanotype where you take your negative, put it on the paper and expose to light, that's how that print was made. And we believe that he made that in the field. So photographed, developed the negative, and then he develops this print
And
in
that's
the
the
field.
original.
That's
And
original.
it's still lasting this quality.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's changed over the time, but that's the part that amazes me.
And that photograph, you know, we hung it on the wall and we've got all these other photogravures. And I kept looking at it, there's something different about this picture. And then I had to take it out of the frame, and then I realized, well, it's not the traditional. And then I found it was what they call a POP. Fast, and it's a beautiful print. And so that would have been a contact print from 11 by 14 negative in the field.
In the field.
Isn't that nuts?
So he, like we have to do, you wait till it's dark,
Sure.
goes in his
Yeah.
tent,
Yeah.
does the processing, and, yeah,
Good.
Fingers crossed, and in the morning it should be good.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
No light
Or
meter,
if
no
you-
histogram.
Right.
None of those modern day conveniences, which drives Coleen nuts.
What, that there's no histogram?
Well, just
There's
There
no
is.
feedback until
till we get home
Yeah, a
from a
month
trip.
later
So we
and-
may have spent thousands of dollars to be on a trip and photograph several descendants, and we don't know if there was a problem with the
Yeah.
film or.
Think back when
When we did film, doesn't that make you a better photographer?
Absolutely.
While you're photographing, while you're there shooting it, you're
Absolutely.
more on top of it.
I kept telling her, don't worry about it. I got this covered. She's still
you
not
stand back there with a
comfortable.
Polaroid just in case.
I still, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, just because, I mean, it's like how we used to be nervous about shooting weddings, and
And then we'd put the film in the mail and send it
we'd
to the
send it
lab.
in the
send it
mail,
out
yes,
across
and
the
then you'd
country.
get that call from the lab that says, we had a couple of your rolls get stuck in the print, or the processor when it was going
Yes,
through, and we don't know what was on it, and you're like, a wedding ceremony?
Yeah, right, yeah, the ceremony, not even the portraits or something you
Right.
could recreate, it was the,
Right, yeah, so, yeah, same kind of nervousness, but
But that also built the drama and the anticipation. And when you'd see that finished image and it was what you dreamed of, you can't make it.
Sometimes it's like, did I take
yeah. Wait a minute,
Oh, yeah, maybe. Where'd that one come from?
that's too cool.
Wow.
Well, in so many ways, I think that we're spoiled, if you will, with technology in where it's gone. And of course, it can and a lot of times is a two-edged sword. But to think of in terms of the technical aspect of what he did and others in those days, I mean, we're looking at ISOs that can go up to 25,000, and and here they were working with what, 8, 10, something like that, 14, 20.
Yeah, what was the glass plate speed?
From when he started to when he ended, and I contacted Kodak to find out, that range would have been ASA 6 to 14. But the other thing that was going on at that time were silent movies, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's where Kodak was putting all the development into film advancement, was with the silent film. And that was a cellulose nitrate film. And I think when he got done shooting the Alaska trip in 27, might have been as high as 40 or 60. Wow. And so now he's got pictures of people smiling. Yeah.
Right, yeah, you can,
So Alaska was the only time that he consistently used film versus glass plate negatives. We have found some images that the original is a film negative, but for the most part, he used the glass plate
is he still
dry
using a
process.
11x14 film, or had he changed?
No, he changed. So you can imagine the bulk and the
Yeah,
weight of
that's
that
what I'm
thing.
thinking, Exactly.
Beautiful negatives, but wow, So he was always trying different cameras, different lenses, different film, much like what we do today. He was experimenting to see what was going to work best.
Sure.
He got hooked up with a Kodak Primo Reversible, and it was a whole plate size, which is a 6.5 by 8.5 inch negative. And so reversible, so he could take the back and flip it between horizontal and vertical, is where it got that name. And
Well, and I knew that as a rotating back on a view camera, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Same concept.
yeah.
yeah. And his son, Harold, my Uncle Hal, talked about his dad, finding some German lens in Seattle that he absolutely fell in love with. And we believe it was a Turner Reich that was produced back in those early days, which is the same lens I'm using today,
Wow.
out of the late 1800s.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah,
How,
it's kind
how tough was that to find those lenses?
There's actually a few around. It wasn't too hard to find.
Well, because someone pointed it out and said, here, you need to be using this lens.
It happened to be that lens. And I imagine the quality is still absolutely outstanding.
Well, the images render almost exactly like the stuff Great Gramps was doing. So I think it probably was that brand anyway. It wasn't that lens, but
Right.
Because we've used different lenses in newer lenses, but they don't they don't have the same feel as what that time period of lenses did. There's a difference.
There's something magical about film or analog versus digital, like vinyl records versus CDs. If you really pay attention, there's a subtle difference there. And this is what we struggled with early on. I mean, we struggled mightily. And we tried renting all different kinds of lenses to put on our D850s. Coleen's super good, as you guys know, at Photoshop. I'm decent at Photoshop. And man, we couldn't
make them look the same.
Not even close.
We tried tilt shift lenses.
You're talking digital.
Digital.
Yeah.
We tried Petzval
A
lenses.
Russian-made Petzval lens for the Nikon mount.
We tried different lenses. We tried different film speeds. We tried, Photoshop and
It probably all looked good, but it wasn't that same quality.
They were
right.
beautiful.
It just wasn't the same. And my apprehension was, you don't just pick up a view camera and be an expert at it and expect to get Curtis quality images. But I underestimated my husband and his abilities.
Wait a minute.
I told you he was good. Colleen, come on.
And he
was
has
talking
had
Photography, John.
Whoa.
I see an edit there.
I couldn't resist.
Or not.
his experience, though it be a while back, this fast was back at just how to use a view camera and lenses and everything working that way. His darkroom experience.
So was that your game plan originally, was to do the project digitally? Or
If we could have.
Initially, and then it
And I-
morphed into going
Yeah.
Mr. Curtis's way.
Did you
I
realize
thought-
that it wasn't going to work?
Well, soon we realized that
I
wasn't going to
realized it
work.
through the process, but beforehand, did you even have a concept
No,
that this is
I thought
going to be fine?
this is digital, this is advanced technology, we got Photoshop, we can make it look any way we want. And I couldn't, digital captured way too much detail, is how I would characterize it compared to analog film.
And we decided early on that we wanted it to have the Curtis look and feel.
Absolutely.
That we didn't want to go full color, digital, and though Curtis may have, because he was at the cutting edge of a lot of things, like retouching negatives and, artwork on negatives.
Okay.
So that's a whole nother subject, but so we, a lot of times our question to ourselves was, what would Curtis do?
There you go.
We never say that.
How would he handle that? And, with the unpublished images, which is another topic we'll get to, the question was, do we just scan these prints and leave them as they are? Or do we, fix the cracked glass plate and fix that? Or, the part of the emulsion that stuck and came off, do we fill that in? How much of this do we correct? And we decided, what would Curtis want? Would he want these images out there? Would he have retouched them? Yes. And so that was the direction that we went, and that we wanted them to carry forward that
Technical
ancestral,
excellence as much as the
right.
the quality.
And quality was always his top priority in how things were printed, the different processes that he used, and the equipment that he used. He could have used easier, quicker. He could have gotten a Kodak brownie and just went out and shot it as waste.
He
And
despised the brownie.
Really, you actually saw some copy
He's-
where he said that, huh?
Yes.
That's too funny.
So, yeah, so that was kind of our decision on equipment and why we went the way we went, and John's ability had a lot to do with that.
Okay, because you triggered a thought just a second ago about embellishments or retouching. To
Yes.
what degree did he do that? Because I mean, what I've seen just looks so purist to me.
He definitely took out spots, scratches, fingerprints, all that kind of stuff that we do today.
Right.
He altered a few images, but in the grand scheme of things, it's such a small percentage. Most of it wasn't altered in any way.
Okay. As
There-
far as the subject,
Yeah.
okay.
Yes.
There's,
But I can appreciate your fingerprints, because I can see how that can happen, and scratches.
It happens. One of the fun stories that I've got from Great Gramps is this trip in the canyon to Shea and Navajo land. He takes his whole family in, and it's probably 1904, somewhere in that area. And so he's got his wife Clara's with him. He's got his firstborn, my Uncle Hal, and his oldest daughter, my Aunt Beth, and my Grandma Florence, all out there in a horse-drawn wagon with all their gear, their camera gear, their cook gear, their supplies, everything. And I think Hal said it took about a week to get into the canyon
Goodness.
by horse-drawn wagon.
which if you've been in the canyon, the base is sand, deep sand.
I'm sure they got stuck a few times along the way.
Yeah.
Probably,
It's-
yeah.
It's not easy traveling.
No. So they're back in there, and I think if you're familiar with the photo Canyon de Shea, it's this beautiful canyon with horse riders going through the canyon. And interesting about this photograph, if you look at that up on the left side at the tail end of the last rider, you go up the canyon wall, there's a profile of a face coming out of the canyon. You can see a nose and a chin and an eye socket, and it's looking down on the riders, kind of as if it were watching them. So there is that's always interesting. The other thing that I found really interesting, and I'll backtrack a little bit, is we, through the family archives, have one of the studio negatives from Canyon de Shea that's been passed down. We were doing a fundraiser early on, so I had digitized it. We're going to have photogravure prints made, and Colleen put together an amazing Kickstarter that got us off and running, selling these. And so I've scanned it, got it up on the computer, and I'm retouching out the dust spots, the scratches, which there were many, some fingerprints. I'm getting all that stuff out, and then I catch myself where I'm editing the same thing all over the negative. And so I undo those edits, and I'm looking at it, and it's unusual. It's this specular highlight with radiating light shafts coming off of it.
Just anywhere, not reflecting off of something, just in the sky.
Best I can tell.
Wow.
You know, and so if you look at those, to your point, Jeff, they're in the shadows of the canyon on that back canyon wall. So photographically,
Sun's
we
not
know,
hitting that area.
yeah, sun's got to reflect off of that and back to the camera. Well, the sun's at a different angle, and it's put that whole background into shadows. So it's not something reflecting off the sun. I take this negative or my scan, and I go to one of our friends who helped me get set up with our view camera, Quinn Jacobson, phenomenal photographer, and he does the antique processes, the old school stuff. He's really good at what he does. And I say, Quinn, look at this. Tell me what you see. And so he's looking at it, he says, John, I think you should check out nitrate sprites. And so I do, and I'm looking on the internet, and they don't quite look like what this anomaly looks like that I've got. And the other thing that I realize, if it's a defect on the negative, like a scratch or a spot or something like that, through scanning, that part's going to be razor sharp. And these are not. They have the same level of focus that the rest of the image does, which tells me that it came through the lens and recorded on the film. So Colleen and I are down in Canyon de Chelly, and we take some Navajo guides to run us through the canyon and explain stuff to us. And I'm talking to them about this, and they say, oh, well, those are orbs. Yeah, orbs, yeah, spirit orbs. And they go on to tell us that the whole canyon is full of this stuff. Some people see it, some don't. There's spirit vortexes all through the canyon. It's a very sacred place for the Navajo.
Sure.
And so out of the 40,000 some negatives that he used, this is the only one that has this anomaly in it. None of the rest have it that we've seen ever.
Not that we've
Did they mention anything about what the orbs mean? They do? Are they benevolent, malevolent? I would imagine they're, in their spirituality, there's benevolent as well as malevolent.
They didn't go into that detail with us, so I don't know the
I'm
answer to
just
that.
curious. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I saw, I like to think of the face watching down and the spirit orbs
That's true.
guiding
Guiding. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
the
Yeah.
natives through the canyon in a safe manner. And so as the story goes, he had 3 natives on horseback, followed by another 3 on horseback.
Okay.
And if you look at the picture, that back group has 4. And so old man Curtis is looking at the composition, goes, well, I don't like the 3 and the 3. So he tells his son Hal to grab a blanket and get on the back of a horse. And so that's Uncle Hal at the very end.
Oh,
But the
that's
rest
cool.
of them are all natives there.
He wants to work with odd numbers.
Imagine that. Imagine that. And so I've shown this picture. I've got a copy on my iPhone that I'll share with you guys of the negative with
Yeah.
pointers to the
Yeah,
orbs.
nice. Yes, definitely.
But I've shown it to other natives, and it doesn't matter who, if Crow or Navajo or who we show it to, without telling them anything else, what do you think this is? Oh, those are spirit orbs.
Wow.
And they just
Wow.
right off the bat.
Very cool.
Yes.
These stories are just so intriguing and fascinating. I'm going to ask to draw on one more story. I understand there's an association that Mr. Curtis had with General Custer.
Well, of sorts. So I believe, how far back do I go on this? So there was a famous Crow warrior named White Swan. And supposedly, before Curtis had been onto the Crow Reservation, he had already passed. Yet Curtis has got this copyrighted photograph of White Swan. And we've seen a copy of it. It's definitely got the Curtis Studio stamp in the lower left, so it's a platinum print. And it's a beautiful portrait. And it's prior to his 3 field seasons into the Crow Reservation. I believe Curtis spent some time with White Swan and learned about the Crow Scouts that worked with Custer at that.
Okay.
I think it was that trip that piqued his interest.
Okay.
So Curtis comes back for 3 different field seasons to research from the native scouts, and these were Crow warriors that worked with the U.S. Army and General Custer. And so he ends up spending 3 seasons out there, finding out from the people that were there at the battle what happened from their point of view. And they lead Curtis through the battlefield, and we've got a hand-drawn map that Curtis made. And the interesting thing is that it's not in distance, it's in time. 5 minutes on horseback from this point to this point, 10 minutes here, 7 minutes there. And so they lead them through the battlefield, and they describe the events as they recall. And Curtis says they had amazing clarity in what they shared with them about this battle. And so Curtis gathers all this information through 3 different seasons. And he's got correspondence with different generals that were there, current day generals that he's corresponding with, trying to piece together what actually happened. Because what Curtis is getting from the Crow warriors that were there working with Custer is far different than what historians had written. Mm-hmm. So he compiles all this information. It's going to go into volume 3, and volume 3 does contain the field map of the war and what happened.
Very good.
But he had published a preliminary report in a newspaper, and Custer's wife read this. She goes to President Roosevelt and says, "How can you let this Indian lover talk this about my late great husband, a true warrior?" And so Roosevelt and Curtis, they get together, they discuss it, and Curtis agrees to put in kind of a watered down version into the volume. So he knows that the truth has to come out at some point. And so he gives all the documentation to his son Hal and tells Harold, when the time's right, give this to the appropriate people.
And you're the right time.
And so in 1986, a year before Hal passes, he gives it to the Smithsonian.
Oh, okay.
And it's fascinating, as I've gone back and done Google research on what happened, and in '86, the dialogue changes. Custer's no longer a war hero, but now he's painted as somebody that was jaded in his military decisions by his passion to maybe even become president. So he had all these ambitions that were at play that probably led to some poor decisions on the battlefield. And so now, the truth is out, and it speaks to what the natives have known all along.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, and the victor always writes the history, right?
Yeah.
But in that one case, the natives were the victor.
But
And-
that couldn't be admitted.
Who's taking credit now for coming up with this correct version of the battle?
The Crow warriors, I believe.
Are they being given credit?
I haven't. I have to honestly say I haven't done the research to
Well,
know exactly where that.
our last trip out to Crow Agency, we got to see the reenactment of the battle. We were staying with a family that owns the property where that happened.
This is that last trip you were on too.
Yes.
Yeah, we're just back a couple
We
of weeks
just
from that.
we're just back from Montana, and where a lot of the battle took place is on the Real Bird family's land. And so they do enact a reenactment
The
each
correct
year.
reenactment.
Yes.
Well, their reenactment includes a ton of history about, what is a coup and what was the women's role and things, and how did the battle go down, and the horses involved, and so there's a lot to it that's just really interesting to learn, and not just the battle itself.
Well, this really leads us into an interesting next part of this visit. You mentioned that you just got back from Montana. You've been on many trips before. Let's visit about how this is feeding into your project. You're well-traveled. Let's talk a little bit. How many places have you been? What have you been doing? And in all of these places that you've been visiting, I'm sure, is bolstering and research and whatever you need to do to support and edify the foundation. Am I on the right track?
Absolutely, yes.
She's
Me or you?
Who's going to talk about
Where do we
this?
start?
We've been from Alaska down to Florida. We've photographed. Actually, we photographed a woman who Curtis photographed in 1927 at 3 years old, and we got to photograph her at 94 years old.
Wow.
And so she was Alaska native. We photographed her in Florida. She was living with her daughter, one of her daughters at the time in Florida. And we got to hear stories directly from her. And she remembered Curtis coming
Really?
because he was a white man and he had blue eyes and he dressed really funny. And she remembered in seeing the photograph, she's like, I wasn't happy because my parents made me come in from playing outside, and that's why I look so sad in that picture.
And she does. She's got a pout going.
Yes, so she was explaining things, and so that was an incredible experience to get to talk with her. And then she moved to Colorado Springs, which is only 2 hours from here, back in with another daughter and her family, and so we got to have a lot more interaction with her and interviewed her another time. She actually came over here when we did an exhibit on our unpublished Alaska book, and she came over and told stories during our presentation.
Oh, nice.
And everyone loved her. But so we've had that experience. We've photographing Chief Henry Red Cloud. We photographed him before he became chief, and then he called us and said, "John Coleen, I want you to come to my making of a chief ceremony. Will you bring the big camera?"
And where was this?
That was in South Dakota.
Pine Ridge Reservation.
No, it wasn't on Pine Ridge.
Oh, the making of the chief
It
was
was at
Rosebud.
Bear Butte Mountain, which is up by where they do the big motorcycle rally.
Oh, Sturgis?
Sturgis.
Well, it's
up by
close.
Sturgis.
Close to that
Yeah.
area, yeah.
So anyway, so we've gotten to hear his whole story. We've been to Vancouver Island and photographed and interviewed 2 different artists there. One is a chief, one's about to become a chief. 2 different people that really don't have much to do with their culture. It's part of their past, and they know their family. They just are choosing not to participate in it for various different reasons. So it's run the whole gamut from, just what we see as Euro culture or white culture to being chief of their tribe. And
Well, I can appreciate the fact that we've got these generations, familial generations, a bloodline going on here. And I can appreciate the passion that both of you have in this project, to the extent, my great-grandfather was Edward Curtis, and I have some of his photographs. I know a little bit, actually quite a bit about him, but it would be so easy to say, and that's nice.
Just let it go at that.
And let it go at that. So what drives you in this project?
You have been listening to Conversations with John and Coleen Graybill. We've been chatting with them about John's great-great-grandfather, Edward Curtis, who photographed the Native American back in the early 1900s. Wonderful stories and a lot more to come, part 2. Stay tuned.